read aloud in early synagogues, casually cited by authors whose writings made it into the New Testament, and preserved by communities from Ethiopia to the Dead Sea. One ancient text enjoyed widespread authority before being quietly set aside in the early centuries of the Common Era, not burned, not condemned, in a single dramatic council. Quietly retired, the way an institution retires anything inconvenient, by simply stopping the copying, stopping the citation, letting the manuscripts thin out until the book existed only at the edges of the tradition that had once claimed it as scripture. What it actually contains, not what it is rumored to contain, is considerably more disturbing than the version that circulates online. Because the problem with this book was never that it was too strange. The problem was that it was too specific. My name is Dr. William Carver, and I've spent 40 years with my hands in the sand of ancient Egypt, which means I've also spent a great deal of time in the manuscript rooms that sit just behind the excavation sites, in the collections, where the textual record either confirms what the ground is telling you or quietly contradicts it. The Book of Enoch is not an Egyptian text, but it became an Egyptian problem. The oldest surviving complete copies came out of the dry climate of the Upper Nile Valley, carried south by a church that never stopped treating it as scripture, and several of the fragmentary Hebrew and Aramaic versions that changed our understanding of the text's earliest layers came from the same Judean desert deposits that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls in the middle of the last century. What I want to do today is read this book the way I read an inscription, layer by layer, beginning with what it plainly says, then asking why that was enough to get it set aside. If you want the real story the texts actually tell, click subscribe, because that is what I dig into here every week. So, let's get into it. Start with what the object actually is, because the popular frame has done it real damage. If you know the Book of Enoch at all, you probably know it through one of two channels. Either you encountered it as a conspiracy artifact, the book they suppressed, the manual for understanding Nephilim and fallen angels, and everything the church wanted buried, or you came across a passing academic reference that filed it under Jewish pseudepigrapha and moved on. Both of those framings have the same effect. They pre-answer the interesting questions before a reader gets to the first page. Strip both frames, and here is what you actually have. The Book of Enoch is not one book. It is 5 distinct compositions, bundled together over several centuries, probably written across a span running from roughly the 4th century before the Common Era down into the 1st century of it. They are attributed to Enoch, the figure Genesis introduces in 7 verses, the man the text says walked with God and was not, for God took him a patriarch who, uniquely in the Hebrew genealogies, does not die. He disappears, and a figure who disappears rather than dies is a figure who can return, which is a figure who can testify. That is the theological engine the whole composite text runs on. The 5 sections are the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. Each has its own character, its own concerns, and almost certainly its own origin. They are not a unified work the way a novel is a unified work. They are more like a dossier, separate reports, filed by different hands, bound together because they were all making versions of the same argument. And here's the first piece of real value I want to give you, because it runs against almost everything the popular version claims. The oldest section of the most occult book in popular archaeology is a calendar document. The Astronomical Book, which scholars generally treat as the earliest piece of the composite, is a precise, methodical, almost tediously detailed account of the movements of the sun and moon through a schematized year. It is written in the voice of a prophet receiving revelation from an angel, but what the angel is revealing is not mystical. It is a calendar. The kind of document a farming community needs to know when to plant, when to hold a feast, when the sacred cycle turns. I want you to hold on to one specific detail from that calendar, because I will come back to it and it matters more than it appears to. The astronomical book encodes a year of exactly 364 days, not 365. Not the lunar year of roughly 354. Exactly 364, which divides into 4 seasons of 91 days each, 13 weeks each, with every annual festival falling on the same day of the week, every year, without exception. The text insists, with what reads as genuine polemical heat, that this is the calendar ordained at creation, that those following the lunar calendar of the Jerusalem temple establishment are in fundamental error, keeping the feasts on the wrong days, out of alignment with the structure of heaven. I'll come back to why that number matters and why anyone would smuggle a calendar dispute into a prophetic text. Hold on to it. Now to the section everyone actually wants to talk about, and I want to read it more carefully than it usually gets read. The Book of the Watchers takes 6 verses from Genesis, the passage about the sons of God, who saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful, and expands them into a structured, detailed narrative. Divine beings descend to earth. They take human wives. They produce offspring. They are punished. The flood follows. That is the broad shape, and it is familiar enough to have generated a small industry of speculation. But there is a word at the center of this text that deserves more attention than it usually gets, and this is the place where a precise reading changes the whole picture. The beings in question are called, in the Aramaic of the oldest fragments, Irim. The translation you will see most often is angels or watchers, and neither is wrong, but neither is quite right either. Irim means, literally, those who are awake, those who do not sleep, the ones who watch, in the sense of standing guard through the dark hours when everything else rests. It is explicitly contrasted in the text with the condition of biological creatures who are governed by cycles of sleep and waking, activity and rest, birth and death. The watchers stand outside that rhythm. They do not have it. Now hold that against what the text says their transgression actually is. The standard translation reaches for the language of moral failure, lust, corruption, defilement, and those words are present. But the surrounding vocabulary in the Aramaic, in the sections that survive in something close to their original form, is the vocabulary of category crossing, of mixing what belongs in separate domains. When the watchers descend and take wives, the text is not describing a crime of passion. It is describing a structural violation, a boundary between kinds of being, treated in the text as a boundary built into the order of creation that has been crossed in the wrong direction. The transgression is not the desire, it is the crossing. What was on each side of that boundary, and what the crossing released into the world, is what the text spends the rest of its length trying to account for. And I want to be careful here, because this is precisely the point where a video like this usually tips over into a claim I cannot support. I am not telling you the Watchers were physical beings of extraterrestrial origin who interbred with the human population of the ancient Near East. That reading requires ignoring an enormous amount of context, and it requires treating as literal description a text that is doing several other things at the same time: theological argument, political polemic, coded commentary on a specific historical moment. What I am telling you is that the allegorical reading, while entirely defensible, has the effect of making the text less strange than it actually is. And this is a text that does not want to be made comfortable, because it does something almost no other ancient mythology does. It gets specific. The Book of the Watchers does not stop at naming the transgression in general terms. It lists what the Watchers taught. It names individual beings and assigns each a domain of knowledge transferred to humanity. The list includes the working of metals and the forging of weapons. It includes cosmetics and techniques of adornment. It includes what the text calls enchantments and root cutting, which in the context of the ancient Near East refers to the practical pharmacology of plants, the knowledge of which roots heal and which harm. It includes the reading of celestial signs, the interpretation of the sky. Read that list quickly, and it looks like a catalog of forbidden arts, the usual package of magic and temptation. Read it slowly, and a different shape emerges. These are not random transgressions. They form a coherent curriculum, the means of making war, the means of attraction, the means of prediction, the means of working matter into tools. The Watchers are not teaching chaos. They are teaching a toolkit. And the text's judgment of this toolkit is not that the knowledge is evil in itself. The text is very precise on this point. The judgment is that the knowledge was transmitted outside the proper channel, to the wrong recipients, at the wrong time, without authorization. The problem is not content. The problem is source. That framing unauthorized transmission of legitimate knowledge carries a weight that the fallen angels taught magic reading entirely misses. The Book of Enoch was composed during a period of intense dispute within Second Temple Judaism about the sources of valid authority. Which priests were legitimate? Which interpretations of the law carried weight? Who speaks for heaven and on what basis? A story about beings who bypassed proper channels to transmit knowledge directly to humanity is not, in that context, a myth about the distant past. It is an argument about the present. And that argument made in prophetic code, attributed to a figure who predates and therefore outranks any current authority, is precisely what made the book useful to some communities and deeply uncomfortable to others. Let me pause here for just a moment. 40 years of reading ancient documents teaches you more than any one script could hold. The tombs, the manuscripts, and the arguments buried inside the texts, the official record, decided to stop copying. I finally put the whole of it together in one place, a book, start to finish, laid out plain. The link is pinned at the top of the comments. Everything in one place. No hunting through videos to find it. Take it or leave it. Now, back to the text, because the strangest section of Enoch is not the Watchers. It is the one almost nobody reads. Now I want to return to that calendar. The 364-day year. I said to hold on to it, and here is why it matters. A year of exactly 364 days is elegant in a way the actual solar year refuses to be. It divides perfectly. Every feast lands on the same weekday every year. There is no drift, no correction, no awkward intercalary month to argue about. And the text insists this is not a human convenience. It is the structure of creation itself, the rhythm the heavens were built to run on. The lunar calendar, the calendar the Jerusalem temple establishment actually used, the calendar that governed when the festivals were held, when sacrifices were offered, when the sacred calendar of Israel turned, is described in the astronomical book as a corruption, an error, a departure from the ordained order that has put the whole religious life of the community out of alignment with heaven. Think about what that means in practice. If the astronomical book is right, then every Passover held on the wrong date is not really Passover. Every Day of Atonement observed on the wrong day is not really observed at all. The entire apparatus of temple worship, the priesthood, the sacrificial calendar, the institutional structure of Judaism in the Second Temple period is running on the wrong clock. That is not a fringe theological quibble. That is a direct attack on the legitimacy of the religious establishment, delivered in the voice of the most authoritative witness available, a man who walked with God, was taken up without dying, and came back to report what he had seen. The communities that most valued this argument, the ones who used the 364-day calendar, who believed the Jerusalem priesthood was corrupt, who copied Enoch in greater quantity than almost any other text, were the communities whose manuscripts ended up in the caves above the Dead Sea. And when those caves were sealed, sometime around the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, and those communities scattered or disappeared, the tradition that carried Enoch most carefully went with them. What survived was the tradition that had been skeptical of Enoch's claims all along. The rabbinic movement that consolidated in the decades after the temple's destruction established, gradually and through dispute rather than decree, a bounded set of texts it would center its practice around. Enoch did not make that list. And this is the part I want to be precise about, because the popular version of this story almost always gets it wrong. There was no moment, no council of authorities who sat down with a complete Bible in front of them and voted to remove a book that was already inside it. The canon of the Hebrew Scriptures was not a finished object that was then edited. It was a process, an argument, a negotiation conducted over generations among communities that did not always agree. What happened to Enoch is slower and more banal than removal. The communities that had used it most were gone. Their libraries were sealed in caves or scattered. The manuscripts thinned. And the communities that survived, that rebuilt, that carried the tradition forward, were precisely the ones Enoch had been arguing against. A text that tells the establishment its calendar is wrong, its priestly authorization is compromised, and its entire liturgical life is out of alignment with heaven, tends not to be lovingly preserved by the institutions it accused. That is not a cover-up. It is the quiet arithmetic of what gets copied and what does not. Every generation of scribes makes choices about what to carry forward. When the communities that valued a text are gone, the text goes with them unless something else intervenes. In the case of Enoch, something else did. The Ethiopian church alone among Christian communities never stopped treating the text as scripture, never removed it from its canon, never relegated it to a curiosity, never stopped making copies. And it was in Ethiopia that the oldest surviving complete manuscripts were found, carried to Europe by an 18th-century Scottish traveler named James Bruce, who brought back several copies from his time in that country and deposited them in various collections. That is not a dramatic origin story. It is an unglamorous one. The text survived, not because of a hidden lineage or a secret tradition, but because one church on the African continent kept doing what church attention to what he was looking at. The scholarly work that followed was similarly undramatic. A 19th-century Oxford scholar named R.H. Charles spent years producing a critical edition and translation of Enoch in English. His work is the foundation on which virtually every popular account of the text rests, including the accounts that do not mention him. The manuscripts he worked from, the translation decisions he made, the textual problems he identified, all of it is sitting in the public record, available to anyone who wants to go looking. The text was never hidden. It was simply not prioritized, and then it was rediscovered through the ordinary channels of scholarship, which are slower and less exciting than discovery usually sounds. And the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the picture further. When those materials were found in the caves above Qumran beginning in 1947, Enoch was there in fragments, multiple copies, multiple sections, in Aramaic and Hebrew. Older than anything Bruce had brought from Ethiopia by a considerable margin. The astronomical book was there. The Book of the Watchers was there. Every major section of Enoch was attested in those caves except one. And the absence of that one section is one of the most discussed problems in the entire field of Second Temple studies. The Book of Parables, the second major section of the composite, has no Qumran attestation, not a fragment. Every other piece of Enoch was copied and kept by the community at Qumran, apparently in multiple exemplars. The Parables section appears only in the later Ethiopian manuscripts. Scholars have argued about this for decades. The most straightforward explanation is that the parables were composed late enough that the Qumran community did not have them, which would place their composition somewhere in the 1st century of the Common Era. Others have argued for an earlier date and suggested the parables simply were not among the texts that community chose to copy. Neither position has closed the argument. What makes this matter is what the parables actually contain. At the center of that section is a figure referred to by 3 overlapping titles: the Son of Man, the Chosen One, and the Righteous One. This is a heavenly being who existed before creation, who will sit on a throne of glory at the end of the age, who will judge the powerful of the earth, kings and rulers, and those who have trampled the righteous underfoot, and before whom even the angels will bow. That figure does not appear in the canonical Hebrew scriptures in anything approaching this form. When the Gospel of Mark, in its trial scene, records Jesus responding to the high priest with the phrase, "You will see the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of power," coming with the clouds of heaven, the imagery has a home. It is not self-generated. It is drawing on a vocabulary that existed, that circulated, that people recognized. The book of parables is that vocabulary. The precise relationship between the parables of Enoch and the specific texts of the New Testament is one of the most actively contested questions in Second Temple scholarship. Did the writers of the Gospels have direct access to the parables as a written text? Were they drawing on oral traditions that carried the same imagery without a written intermediary? Did the parables themselves develop partly in response to early Christian usage of this language, rather than preceding it? Those questions have not been settled. I am telling you that plainly because they have not been, and anyone who tells you otherwise is simplifying a debate that is still running. What is settled, and this is the thing worth sitting with, is that a book containing the conceptual vocabulary that became central to early Christian thinking about a coming heavenly judge was set aside by the tradition that shared the same root. The rabbinic tradition that developed out of the surviving strands of Second Temple Judaism did not carry Enoch forward. The majority of Christian communities followed that lead, treating the text as interesting but not authoritative. Only the Ethiopian church held it as scripture. And the result is that for the better part of 15 centuries, the conceptual infrastructure behind some of the most important claims in the New Testament was sitting in manuscripts that most of the tradition making those claims had never read. So let me give you the honest version of what we are actually looking at, because I think it is harder to face than the conspiratorial version and considerably more true. The Book of Enoch was not removed from a Bible that existed in the form we imagine it. There was no table of contents agreed upon by a single authority that one morning included Enoch and the next morning did not. What happened was a process, and the process was driven less by theological decision than by historical catastrophe. Rome destroyed the temple in 70 of the Common Era. The communities most invested in the apocalyptic, calendrically rigorous priestly reform tradition that Enoch represented were the ones that catastrophe hit hardest. Their libraries went into the ground or burned with their cities. The tradition that survived and rebuilt was the one that had already found Enoch's arguments inconvenient. A text does not get removed from the Bible. It gets left behind by the communities that might have carried it, for reasons that are mostly military and demographic, rather than theological. And that version of the story, the sober one, the documented one, is, to my mind, genuinely stranger than the conspiracy version, because the conspiracy version implies intention, a decision, someone who knew what they were doing. The historical version implies something colder. It implies that the shape of what we believe was determined in part by who survived a war, that the texts we inherited were the texts of the survivors, and the texts of the communities that did not survive went into the ground, and we are still digging them up. What the Book of Enoch actually says, stripped of the layer of rumor that has settled over it, is this: there was a correct order to creation. That order was violated at a specific moment, by specific agents, through a specific mechanism, the unauthorized transmission of knowledge across a boundary that was not supposed to be crossed. The violation produced the disorder that preceded the flood. The flood was a reset, but not a complete one, and the restoration of correct order requires a witness who stands outside the contaminated chain of transmission, a figure who was taken up without dying and can therefore speak from outside the system he is correcting. Whether you read that as theology, as political polemic aimed at a corrupt priesthood, or as mythology doing what mythology does, mapping the unknown in the vocabulary of the known, it is a coherent argument, made in precise and sometimes genuinely beautiful language. It deserved better readers than it got. Most of the time, the texts that disappeared do. A document does not need to be hidden to become invisible. It only needs the people who valued it to be gone, and the people who remain to have other priorities. The Book of Enoch spent 15 centuries being almost exactly that present at the edges, copied by one church on one continent, quoted occasionally by writers who filed the reference without examining it, sitting in a cave above the Dead Sea, waiting for a climate dry enough to preserve it. We can read it now, and the more carefully you read it, the more clearly you can see not a suppressed secret but a lost argument, one that its own tradition walked away from, for reasons that had less to do with the content of the argument than with who lost the war. Next time I want to take you into the physical manuscripts themselves, what the condition of their survival tells us, what is still sitting in collections partially catalogued, partially read, partially understood. The text is one thing. The object that carried it through 15 centuries is another. And the object almost always has the stranger story. Thank you for watching. Until next time, keep reading what they let lie.